Hey everybody, it's Zach. It's good to see you all. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon. We are, as you probably just heard, about to do some fun conversating about base layers and interoperability. I'm joined by three really great guests representing three really exciting and emerging ecosystems. So we are just gonna get straight to this thing. But first of all, you know, the topic of this panel is centered on interoperability, but obviously interoperability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There's different ways to conceive of this term. So before we get to the meat of it, I wanted to specify our terminology and sort of just do a quick hit around the room to think about how these various projects are thinking about interoperability. And I want to start with Emin, who is with the Avalanche blockchain. You know, when you hear the word interoperability as it relates to the context of, you know, your project, what does that mean to you?
So that's a great question. Without definitions, it's very hard to figure out what people really want when they say interoperability. There are two kinds that I can see. One is external interoperability, where you have disparate chains utilizing different protocols, completely disparate protocols, communicating with each other. This might be useful if you want to tap into an extensive ecosystem that is outside your own control. So for example, many of the new projects want to interoperate with existing smart contracts that exist already on Ethereum. And that's why it's desirable for them to have external interoperability. Another form of interoperability is what we really focus on Avalanche. We also we support external interoperability through bridges. The main thing though that we focus on Avalanche is the ability for different users and different use cases to define their own virtual machines with their own specific virtual machines, specific rules, and also with their specific network membership rule sets. It should be possible for someone defining a new asset to also define who's part of their new network. This is absolutely essential for providing a legal grounding. So when we go around and talk to various enterprises, when we talk to Wall Street, one of the main things they want to do is control the full life cycle of assets that they define. And you cannot do this with a one-size-fits-all first-generation blockchain. So the very simple things that we're all used to, they provide a single rule set, and that's just not enough. So in Avalanche, we were one of the ones to pioneer this essentially bridging the gap between public and private blockchains. We provide a whole range of options in that continuum between the two of them.
Got it. So I want to jump over to Bjorn with Parity Technologies, you know, one of the big forces behind, you know, Polkadot, which is often billed as an interoperability project. And interoperability in the context of Polkadot means something different, really. So I wanted to get your take as to, you know, when you're labeled an interoperability guy, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, as Emin said. There are many different definitions and words being thrown around in the space. I think the approach Emin took is a quite sensible one. You can look at it from a perspective like, hey, you have these disparate, independently secured and validated blockchains such as Ethereum, Bitcoin, and like Polkadot, right? And you could talk about external interoperability between these disparate networks. And that's certainly something that's in scope for Polkadot and has always been, particularly with these predominant blockchains of today, where very valuable assets lie, such as on Bitcoin or Ethereum. And then there is interoperability in some sense. And that applies to us as Polkadot as well, as Polkadot really is like the sharded system of heterogeneous charts. So different looking bits and pieces, right, that talk to each other. And these different looking bits and pieces are essentially blockchains, right, in itself, that have their own custom runtime, or Emin would call it VM in that instance, right? And in these runtimes, again, can be the runtime itself can again be a smart contract platform, right? So like it provides certain functionality, but it could also include this module, the smart contract module, that allows users to deploy code on that chain, just as Ethereum. And in this kind of context, right, if you think about Polkadot as this network of blockchains, right, that can look very differently, these blockchains, interoperability between these chains is really needed to even have a scalable network in some sense, because what you end up with otherwise, right, is this basically network of isolated chains, right, that can't talk to each other and they can't exchange assets and so forth. And very critically, we at Polkadot, how we differentiate ourselves is that we think in order for all that to be successful and to flourish, right, like we need to ensure that all these different chains that communicate with each other internally are secured by the full economic power of Polkadot. And you don't end up in a situation where a weaker link talks to, you know, better secured link, but eventually you end up with a secure equivalent to the weakest link.
Got it. Okay. And then, so Alex, jumping over to you guys at Near, you know, we're hearing sort of like, you know, there's internal interoperability, there's interoperability externally with other chains. This is sort of the network, this federation, this federated interoperability that Polkadot works with. As you guys see it at Near, you know, you'll be the last and final voice in the definitional portion of this event. How are you guys viewing interoperability in the work that you're doing at Near?
So Near, unlike Avalanche or Polkadot, we do not, the concept of internal interoperability applies less. So Near is sharded, and shards do need to communicate to each other. But shards on their own, they're homogeneous. And so when the user or a developer uses Near, they usually don't even think about sharding, they just deploy their application. And communication between applications among shards happens transparently. And so that is less observed by the users. While external interoperability, we find it a very fascinating concept, because there are many use cases. Different use cases require different protocols, right? So proof of stake has fundamentally different security than proof of work, right? So with the emergence of all the protocols, Ethereum and Bitcoin will remain dominant blockchains for use cases where people do want to have the security that proof of work provides, right? Polkadot or Cosmos or Avalanche, they were great for people who want to deploy their chain and be within the ecosystem where they can communicate to other chains within that ecosystem, right? Or Near, that would be a good choice for people who want to deploy applications, who think less about various virtual machines, right? And think more from perspective of building applications that live in a certain ecosystem with assets and other applications. And so I think external interoperability is what will help, first of all, define traction, right? So if the network is connected to Ethereum via a secure two-directional bridge, that immediately brings all the assets and allows, especially if the network also supports EVM and allows using MetaMask to interact with it, that can immediately bring certain use cases where people can move something to that network, use some applications, and then, for example, move back, right? But let's say not pay high gas prices, right? And so as that ecosystem of bridges builds and more networks become connected, it also allows people to go, for example, it could be that someone does need certain applications that exist in one ecosystem, but really other ecosystem works best for them. So if the bridges connect all the networks together, that works great, right? And also, when it comes to internal interoperability, it's not something that applies to us directly, but it's very interesting topic from the technical perspective, right? So for example, Bjorn mentioned that multiple chains in one ecosystem might want to have shared security, right? But it is worth mentioning that for some use cases, you might want to have a network which is secured by you. And when the issues with other network cannot affect you, right? So like if we compare Polkadot and Cosmos, this is what the difference. So in Cosmos, they do not share the security. But at the same time, if another network is corrupted and invalid state transition happens, your network cannot be affected. In Polkadot, if invalid state transition happens, relay chain has to roll back. All the party chains can be in the short term affected, right? If I understand Polkadot correctly. So there are many different use cases, many different things people might want, and we definitely want to have all of those networks which provide those different use cases connected.
I saw sort of a sideways nod from Bjorn. So just before we continue, was that characterization of the Polkadot technology correct?
The unmute button. I think this is a very nuanced conversation in general. And in general, it's impossible on a panel like that to discuss that in detail, right? I guess one point to be made in general is that these are all arguments being made about the security rollbacks and so forth are usually economic arguments, right? So we do certain assumptions, rather that we have rational economic actors, right, in this system that behave to a certain extent rationally. And we get to a point where I believe we can make the claim that these rollbacks will not happen, right? So theoretically, yeah, they could happen, but from an economic perspective, they will not happen. Therefore, they won't happen, right? And if you kind of soften up that assumption in some way, then in a lot of our systems, right, a lot of these arguments that we made are kind of whack, right? Yeah, in general, but on the other hand, like I think it's spot on what Alex said with regard to the difference between Polkadot and Cosmos with regard to, like, you know, Cosmos, you have like all these disparate chains that don't share security in any way. They need to secure themselves, which leads to actually big issues in some cases, because as you see, like there are a few examples. If you take a look at, for example, I think Band Protocol, right? Like I think like 100 million network or so market cap, had to obviously seed its own validator set. These own parties incentivize these parties that secure the network, right? They did that via an inflationary token mechanism, right? Via rewards that were between, I think, 7 and 15%. That equates to like, what, about 7-8 million per year that you pay in security, which is a really, really huge amount, right? And the only way to really bring that down, if you share, right, the validation and security mechanism with others in the pair. So that's one argument. And then if you bring down these rewards too much, right, then you might end up with in situation what we've seen with Loom network, for example, right, where the rewards were being brought down so much that all the validators left basically the network, and it isn't secured anymore. So on that end, I think it is absolutely imperative that you build a network, right, where these different bits and pieces share security, right? And you can make those arguments, right, like that if you build a cross-chain application, for example, that rely on logic being executed on different chains or assets living on different chains, that you can make one argument around how safe the overall application is, and don't end up in a situation where your application might rely on this one chain that is really badly secured, but you don't even know about it.
Okay, got it. So thank you for level setting the interoperability conversation. What I wanted to focus on for the remaining 15 minutes or so is sort of the more broader sort of philosophical implications of these new base layers that are kind of just beginning to kind of come into their own. You know, this was obviously the summer of DeFi, in which, you know, decentralized finance on Ethereum really popped off and demonstrated a true product market fit. And I have this sort of like ongoing debate with one of my reporters, and I'm really curious about each of your takes here. Will these subsequent base layers, like, you know, do the thing that is being demonstrated to work elsewhere, but do it better, cheaper, faster? Or will these subsequent base layers kind of find their own sweet spot in ways that we can't even imagine yet? And I'm curious, as you're building these projects, how you're viewing that dichotomy. So I want to kick it to Emin to start this one off. You know, let's take Avalanche, for example. Will Avalanche be a place for better, faster, cheaper, what exists elsewhere, or will it be a place for new things that have yet to be imagined?
It's got to be both. We are working very hard to cover both bases. So Avalanche has a ginormous breakthrough in distributed systems at its core. It has a new consensus protocol, the likes of which had not been seen before. It is the third biggest leap in distributed systems in the 45 years that field has been around. And it is the biggest jump ahead since the Satoshi white paper. So that gives us the speed, it gives us the low transaction fees, and it gives us throughput, but most of all, it gives us very low latency. Latency is of the order that other people cannot even dream of. So that's a huge selling point. And the moment you go from, you know, people who are struggling with 15 transactions per second to, you know, 6,500 transactions per second, you know, you're suddenly faster than 3 times faster than Visa, without making a compromise from decentralization, while being fully decentralized. And that opens up a lot of new doors for you. At the same time, one has to go and allow new functionality. And that comes, for Avalanche, that comes in the form of new virtual machines, new networks, and things that people can do with those things. And you will see that this fall, we're going to be announcing a whole bunch of new assets that others had not even mentioned or thought about before, that have financial uses deep at the heart of our society. So that's what really gets me excited. We are not one of these chains that is targeting a specific use case. I find those to be very limited. You know, chain X for gaming, chain X for gambling, chain Y for this and that. We're not one of those. Of course, gaming and gambling, etc. These can be their own subnetworks in Avalanche. but we're not a one-trick pony. We're here to cover the entire space.
So yeah, Alex, I want to kick that question to you with Near. Is Near a better, faster, cheaper, alternative for various applications, or is it something that is going to have to distinguish itself on its own terms?
Right. So Near is also a general purpose blockchain, right? And from this perspective, if you have a use case which exists on Ethereum today, you can go to Near, you can deploy a contract on a VM. That will work. It will be faster. It will be significantly cheaper. However, I think that decentralized finance it's the first market that was found, which makes sense. It's the closest to the money, and the closest to the money will always be the first. But blockchain has a huge promise in other areas, right? So open web, many fundamental components of the open web will require blockchain at their core, identity, storage, etc. Ownership economy is a very active field with many companies building very good products, looking for markets around the world, which also requires blockchain. So we work heavily with those with many projects in those areas, and I think that the future is not just the financial use case; it's way more, and I think that the blockchains to enable them, they will not only have to fix the speed and price. There's also a huge barrier of entry for users, where today you really have to be either very technical to use blockchains, or you need to be working with someone who is sufficiently technical to use it. Right. So today the barrier of entry is huge, and the set of users is very small. And for that audience to grow, usability has to improve significantly. So that has to be the next step and the next leap.
I'll kick it over to Bjorn. DeFi on Polkadot is like we've had a couple of stories of these, of various networks sort of spinning up to work. It is a little bit different in the Polkadot context, just given how all-encompassing an inclusion for that is. But I'm curious, the more and more you think about Polkadot, where do you think that Polkadot will stand out from the rest of the pack?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and we'll have to see that, right? At the end of the day, Polkadot is, a decentralized network that doesn't really care in and of itself what is being deployed and built on top of it. And in such a way, we also don't control that. We obviously encourage certain things as parity technologies, for example, some ideas that we've seen emerge in the space. But generally, you could say Polkadot is one of the least opinionated frameworks, right? It provides, as the Polkadot network, one thing to all of its constituents, and that's security and validation, right? And communication between those to gain from the network effects, right? From each other of these bits and pieces that are deployed. And we really see a trend towards three things. People building domain-specific chains. So blockchains that present a solution to a certain problem domain. For example, storage, right? Identity, computation, layer 2 scaling solutions, right? That are general. And then we see industry-specific chains. So these are basically, in a lot of cases, platforms in themselves, right? So somebody building on Polkadot, a chain that's a platform in itself. As an example, there would be Akala, right? A very powerful DeFi platform that incorporates certain DeFi primitives within the base of the chain, right? Like the native functionality, but at the same time also acts as a platform where other developers can build on top of, right? And deploy logic via smart contracts. And then last but not least, the third category that I see emerge are these kind of application-specific chains, right? Where this one chain serves just one use case in one specific application, but that a lot less than, for example, these platforms, right? For DeFi, for gaming, we see the one in the enterprise space, at decentralized networks for the life science industry, built by Chronicled, for example, and that's where it really tends to gravitate. And I think the really special and nice thing about that is that you can see by customizing these blockchains, for a specific industry or set of use cases, right? You can make it very advantageous for its users, being by having the gas cost denominated in other currencies, right? Not having to deal with this asset you really don't care about when you want to use the application. Just a very trivial, simple example, right? But that's basically what we are seeing in the Polkadot ecosystem, and which I believe we will see more of.
You both mentioned kind of this idea of base layer sort of being apathetic, right? You exist for things to be built on top of it. So that relies on, attracting developers to do all that stuff. I'll start with Bjorn, and then I definitely want to kick it over to Alex for this question. Where are you seeing success? Like, what are the tools for like incentivizing developer activity on these new networks? Like, what's working, what's not? Bjorn, give me like your last sort of like success story of finding someone to build a cool new thing, within this emerging ecosystem.
And they find us.
Okay, you don't even have to. You're too cool. They come to you.
No. So like a bunch of the things that we've made really good experiences with, right? Has been we have partnered with certain types of incubators, accelerators, just to provide a path to particularly young students, right? To get the opportunity and the setup to really go down the rabbit hole, like, and explore what can be built. We obviously, in our ecosystem, we present the full range of support, from technical support, right, where we really guide people, give workshops, seminars, over financial support, where we have a large network of investors that are just really eagerly waiting for new projects to emerge that they can get involved in. Over like community building and so forth, right? And I think these kind of initiatives really go a long way as they make the entry into an ecosystem a lot easier.
Got it. And Alex, I want to ask you specifically, what's Near's meme strategy going forward, and how are you getting people excited about building on this new thing? Like, what's the Near aesthetic? What are we going to see? What's going to entice people to start building over there?
Right. So we're historically very bad with memes, and so far we have multiple projects building on us. I think there are close to 10 which are shipping soon on the mainnet, and there's many more which are in process. Primarily, where we usually differentiate is on Near you have sort of a path to scaling in the future beyond something that a single chain can sustain. And the second is that today, if you deploy Near, it's very easy to onboard users who are not blockchain native. So we provide we have this concept called progressive security, where until you have sufficient, like if I play CryptoKitties and I have a 10-cent kitty, it doesn't make sense for me to have ledger, to understand what a private key is, etc. Right? It makes sense if I use some solution, as long as by the time I have my assets, which are important for me, it is trivial for me to just switch control to fully being in my control. So for example, in Ethereum, it's from the technological perspective challenging, because if I have my account and that account, the private key is in custody, I cannot make them forget the private key, and the account is defined by it, right? So Near, just the account model already allows you to switch the key on the account and get control of it, right? And so with already having tooling that user-facing that allows users who are not crypto native to start using applications, and first, so application has a chance to prove its use to the user before it forces users to go through the hurdles of, for example, getting the key pair, etc., understanding what the gas fee is. So most of the projects that are building Near, they in some way either leveraging this usability to onboard users, or they have plans in the future to scale beyond, let's say, something like, very few of them actually expect more than, let's say, 1,000 transactions per second constantly, but many of them expect bursts of, let's say, like several dozens of thousands of transactions every second. So that's something they would not be able to sustain on a single chain. But if they can shard across multiple with meaningful communication between them, this is something that will allow them to scale as they grow.
So just for our audience at home, we seem to have lost Emin. He was joining us from the road, and he is gone at the moment. So it's just me, Bjorn, Alex. We're chilling. We're taking questions. Thanks for tuning in to LA Blockchain Week and doing this with us. I definitely wanted to talk about some of the recent news around DeFi on other chains specifically. I thought the interesting thing, like in July, when FTX announced that they were building a DEX called Serum on Solana. That seemed to be an indicator of sort of like, future activity, right? Like, DeFi has built itself on Ethereum, and yet every time I use DeFi and Ethereum, I'm always shocked at like how kind of janky it is, like how rough around the edges it still is, even though it's become this sort of like mammoth enterprise on that chain. I guess my question would be to Alex first, and specifically like, what indicators and developments are you looking out for, when you think about some of these activities, migrating from an Ethereum to another base layer? Are there any like sort of indicators that you think are particularly telling when it comes to developer migration to new chains?
I think if we're talking specifically about DeFi, then liquidity is a pretty easy metric, which I think is pretty meaningful, right? So if we see a lot of liquidity moving to another chain, then that liquidity is there as it is an invitation for other projects to launch. If we're talking about a broader set of use cases, I think that a good metric is the number of active users on the applications that are being deployed, right? So for example, if we imagine ownership economy picking up, let's say within 1 year or two, the number of users who use owner applications which deliver the promise of ownership economy will be a way better metric from perspective of comparing the chains. Hopefully, also by that time, we are in a world where chains are so interoperable that users don't really have to think about and like don't have platform lock-in, right? So that they can easily transfer between the chains, etc. So so are applications. In general, it is the situation today that the market is very small and the number of protocols is pretty large. So it is our common goal to grow the market, and we can only do it collectively, right? And historically, with Polkadot, with Solana, and other protocols, we collaborate quite a bit on that mission. And the collaboration happens on the social layer today. Hopefully, it will be on the technical through the bridges in the future, right? So before we can start competing, it's Hunger Games, right? We first have to actually work together, grow the market, build the ecosystem, deliver on the promises we make, and then we can start competing and see if one of us is actually fundamentally better for any particular use case.
Got it. The next stage, Hunger Games, that'll be fun between the base layer. The real base layer wars will really get going. Bjorn, I wanted to ask you, we only have about a minute left, so we wanted to close it out with you. I wanted to ask you, like, are you seeing people vote with their feet in terms of building on these other chains? What are some indicators that you're looking out for that will tell the broader world that things are picking up in terms of developer activity on Polkadot and other new base layers?
Two points to that. Number one, obviously, we track the ecosystem, and we see tremendous growth over the last really 1.5 years, because you could build on Polkadot before Polkadot was really out, because it was all a game of substrate, right? Giving the people that tool. And I don't know, we have like over 180 companies that build chains. And I mean production chains, and not like a weekend project or like a hackathon project. So I'm not too concerned about that side of thing. What I would like to see more of are projects that make use of these unique value propositions of Polkadot and Substrate, right? These features and tools that give you more access to low-level tools and really let you innovate and make things better, more efficient and better.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bjorn. Thanks so much, Alex. Thanks to Emin, who had to leave a little bit early, but I appreciate you all taking the time and having a fun chat about base layer stuff. So I think with that, I'm going to kick it back to the organizers. We're going to wave bye. We're going to wish everybody a good rest of the day, and go Giants, Blue Dodgers for life. Woo.